Mr. Nick Clegg. He's President, Global Affairs at Meta. He will be joining us for a conversation here with Rudra Chaudhuri, Director, Carnegie, India. Mr. Clegg joined Meta in 2018 after spending almost 2 decades in British and European public life. Prior to being elected to the UK Parliament in 2005, he worked in the European Commission and served for 5 years as a member of the European Parliament. Mr. Clegg, Rudra Chaudhuri.
Nick Clegg, welcome to the Global Technology Summit 2022.
It's very good to be here.
Let me just start with a couple of questions on the future. So let me just get straight to it. What is a company like Meta going to look like 10 years from now?
Well, our big ambition, which I think we've been very overt in sort of spelling out to the world, particularly when we announced the new name for the company, Meta, last autumn, is to be hopefully an important player in the construction of what is in effect an entirely new computing platform, what's loosely called the metaverse. I think the sort of shorthand way of thinking about that is that we are seeking to make this transition from a sort of 2D internet to a 3D internet, such that we graduate from looking at each other on these screens and sort of yelling at each other in sort of passport photo style Zoom lineups, and we graduate to something a lot more immersive, initially through avatars, and then eventually the long-term vision is obviously through holograms, so that there's a sort of embodied sense of presence. And whilst that sounds like some great revolutionary step towards science fiction, and of course the metaverse word is from a book, actually, originally of science fiction, Snow Crash. It is in many ways also quite an evolutionary movement. If you think the way we've moved from clunky desktops to laptops, and now we spend every waking minute with these clasped in the palms of our hands, we think eventually that technology will leap from something we hold in our hands to something we perch on the bridge of our nose. Such that the technology, the physical hardware, becomes increasingly almost invisible and almost organic to use. And if you also look at the way we've moved from sort of long-form text to short-form text to photos to long-form film and video, and now short-form videos are all the rage. It's about 50% of content on Facebook is now short-form video. All of that seems to suggest that when the technology allows for it, human beings reach for forms of communication where they feel as present, one towards the other, even if they are actually geographically far apart. I for some time now, have been holding my weekly team meetings in Meta in the metaverse through something called Horizon Workrooms, which is a space that we've built for people to be able to work together. And even though we're sort of bobbing around like sort of avatars, it's amazing how much you feel as if you're breathing the same air in the sort of virtual room that you're occupying. So that's very much what we hope to. We, of course, will not build the metaverse on our own. It'll be built regardless of whether Meta does or doesn't exist. Lots of others are investing heavily in those augmented and virtual reality technologies. But when you ask about 10 years, it's very difficult to put a sort of timetable to it. This is not something which is going to crystallize overnight. But I certainly would imagine that over the next decade, you will see a very distinct move towards that new computing platform.
You've been a professional politician at the highest level of government.
No, amateur,
almost.
But anyway, yeah.
How is government and governance going to connect with the metaverse? So how do you see, as metaverse evolves over the next 5 to 10 years, how's that going to change in the way in which governments function, diplomacy happens? How do they plug into this?
Well, I think one of the things I hope, it might turn out to be a somewhat naive hope, but if you look back over the last 15, 20 years, I think we can all accept that, particularly through the social media age, these technologies erupted incredibly quickly, spread like wildfire around the world. Our apps and services are used by close to half the world's population now. It's a sort of mind-boggling number. And in many respects, I think we've been almost retrospectively now trying to apply the governance rules to those technologies, not quite as an afterthought, but sort of after the technology's already become so prevalent in society. I mean, here in India, for instance, many of my discussions are this new, sort of tripod of legislation: the Digital India Act, the Telecoms Act, the Data Protection, the DPDP Act. These are all foundational pieces of legislation. The same is happening in Europe. The same debate is happening in Australia, in the UK, in the US. But of course, if you step back for a minute, you think to yourself, well, in an ideal world, those should have come not exactly first, but at the inception of the technologies. The governance guardrails shouldn't be retrofitted onto technology. And so I think one of the things that certainly at Meta we're trying to do is, and we fund many academics around the world, developers. Yesterday I announced that we're helping fund 100 developers in this country on a fellowship to work on sort of open source developments for in the metaverse. What we're trying to do is, in a sense, have those foundational governance debates at the same time as the technology is being developed, so that you don't get this dislocation between technology and governance, which I don't think has been particularly fruitful, because it's been accompanied by this very sort of almost violent mood swing from tech utopianism and tech euphoria at the beginning, and then it's now swung, of course, now to a backlash and sort of tech pessimism. I hope the questions about who governs what on the metaverse is the kind of debate we can have across industry. So, we've set up, or helped set up, along with a bunch of other companies, something called the XR Association. The World Economic Forum brings together me and my counterparts from Microsoft and Google and other companies to have these discussions on some very foundational questions. For instance, everybody agrees that just as in the sort of 2D environment and the 3D environment, you need some basic rules to safeguard people's safety and their privacy and their rights as sovereign data individuals. But if people are moving seamlessly from one part of the metaverse to another, who makes sure those rules are applied consistently? How do we make sure that commerce can move seamlessly from one part of the metaverse to the other? Or indeed digital goods. If I don't know, go watch an Arsenal-Tottenham game in the metaverse, the metaverse in the future, and I buy a digital Arsenal shirt, and I then go and want to listen to a Schubert concert, which so happens to be hosted in the Microsoft metaverse. Can I go with my Arsenal digital shirt that I bought in one part of the metaverse as opposed to another? What do we do about the distinction, which I think will be a very important foundational distinction in terms of governance, between the public spaces in the metaverse, where people will congregate, much as we congregate in public spaces in the real world, and the multitude of very private spaces, maybe just one person, two people, people playing chess, people playing ping pong, having a small discussion. You wouldn't expect in the real world for the state, or indeed for the private sector, to surveil what you're doing in your living room in the same way that they do, or they are entitled to, in a public space. Would we have that same public-private distinction in the metaverse? These are candidly all pretty open and fluid questions now, and I think the more we can have a discussion amongst thinkers and philosophers and sociologists and ethicists and governments and regulators and the industry, and have those debates now and not again retrofit them in 20 years' time, I think the ecosystem as a whole will be the healthier for it.
Okay, I'm going to pick up a couple of threads because there's a lot going on there. We've got sovereignty, there's governance. When you talk about footfalls, privacy in the metaverse, I suppose it would be a 5-year advanced argument around, say, data portability. So how do you deal with those issues? But let me thread it together by taking a step back on regulation itself. Different jurisdictions are now in the process of firing up their own sovereign architectures when it comes to data privacy. Some borrow from cross-border systems, CPTPP or GDPR, which used to be the gold standard. I'm not quite sure it still is the gold standard, arguable perhaps. But many, like India, for instance, are now creating, as you said, tripods, I would say quad, four interrelated bills that will essentially design the architecture. So the first question is, what is your primary concern with regards to the future of data governance, which I think is fair to say we can no longer call global data governance? Would you agree?
I think there is always an underlying danger, particularly at a time, and look, I was in politics for 20 years in European and British politics. I totally understand and respect the wholly legitimate instinct that politicians and governments have around the world to assert what is commonly called digital sovereignty. Of course I understand that. Politicians are accountable to their people. They are there to serve their communities. And quite understandably, politicians feel the world over that they can only serve their community if they somehow insist that they are in charge of their bit of the sort of slice of the data cake, if I can put it like that. The problem, of course, is that that's not the way the internet works. The internet foundationally works on the idea that data flows openly across borders. So I think the balance we're trying to strike in this evolving debate is to ensure that governments, the Indian government is the same as many other governments around the world, are entitled to discharge their wholly legitimate interests in regulating on issues like privacy and content and licensing and so on and so forth, and transparency and accountability, but try and do so in a way which doesn't undermine the ingenuity of the internet, which is undoubtedly based on an immense amount of cross-border fluidity. So you may remember a few years ago, thankfully I think the debate has evolved since then, but a few years ago it was very fashionable to say that data was like oil. And so, of course, it's nothing like oil. In fact, it's almost the direct opposite of oil. I mean, oil is something you just suck out of the ground and burn and then it's gone. The unique thing about data, almost directly contrary to that, is that it's what's called technically a non-rivalrous good. You can use it over and over again. I've got countless apps on my phone, I'm sure you do as well, where you're putting in the same data over and over again. It's far more reproducible and elastic than all of that. And crucially, economies of scale in the internet and the ability to transfer data from one part of the world to the other is an essential ingredient to everything we've come to appreciate. So I think the balance is to ensure that governments do, of course, discharge their duty, their right to regulate the online world, but do it in a way which preserves ingenuity and innovation, which requires the sort of continued protection of open data flows. And I'm really hugely impressed and encouraged to see the way that the Indian government has been very open about the fact, which I think is disproportionately important now as India is about to assume the chairmanship of the G20, that the Indian government has been very clear and pinned its colours in favour of open data flows, not unconditional data flows, of course not. I think it's totally right that the European Union and the US are still in the middle of protracted negotiations about exactly what the legal underpinning is of transatlantic data flows, and that there should be reciprocal expectations and rights and obligations if data is going to flow between one jurisdiction and another. And I think India is entirely entitled to expect the same sort of principle of reciprocity around the world, but doing so in a way which nonetheless retains that openness of data flows. I think if we can get that balance right, and I think we're inching towards a more subtle, nuanced, and mature debate, I think that will be a good thing. Final word, since you mentioned it. I'm not sure if it was said in the introduction, I came in late, but I spent a decade working in the European Union. I went 5 years in the European Commission. I was a British member of the European Parliament in those halcyon days when Britain was still a member of the European Union. Alas, they have now got past. But I think there was a time when the European Union kind of prided itself on being a regulatory leader, even though it wasn't necessarily a leader in sort of tech, and certainly not in big tech compared to the sort of digital powerhouses of India, China, the West Coast and America, and so on. And there was a sense that, GDPR was one of the first pieces of legislation, and many other jurisdictions were emulating it. I don't think that's going to carry on in the same way. I think, for instance, here in India, quite rightly, Indian policymakers are saying, in my view, entirely rightly, look, India is India. India is not the European Union. We have our own needs. We have our own specificities. We're going to craft legislation as a sovereign nation for ourselves. So I think, of course, I hope in my current position on behalf of a global platform that there is as much sort of consistency across different jurisdictions, because if it's too erratic, it becomes incredibly difficult just to do it in practice. But I don't think you're going to get quite this sort of almost copycat followership that you had in some jurisdictions in the immediate aftermath of the passing of the EU's GDPR.
So Nick, let me push you gently a little bit on this. For many of us in India and many other jurisdictions now, localization, let's be honest, is a reality. So whether data is oil or whether it's air, I think whether it's tech nationalism that's guiding it, whether there's an economic argument or a security argument, I think it's clear that localization is here to stay, not only in this jurisdiction, but in many others. Equally, and to take your point, there is obviously a contradiction between that thinking and the need for business, industry, and the future of the internet. Do you think we're just in a process of time where we're going through a space where we're all trying to create a new political, economic, technological settlement? So one way of arguing, the current time is to say is that we're all fragmented. The other way of thinking is to say is that, look, there are these gold standards and we should pull the pear from X or pull the apple from Y. But is this a period of just finding that settlement?
Just before I come to that, and this sounds pedantic, but data localization technically has a very specific meaning, which is literally that data is housed, stored in separate jurisdictions. That's not happening, and if it were to happen, by the way, I think it would be a disaster for India's clear destiny as a world, or already a current digital superpower. You've already got 100 unicorns and counting in this country. By 2024, India is going to have the largest app developer base in the world. All of that is based on the idea that India is able to, with this extraordinary culture of ingenuity and this thirst for science and knowledge, is able to export those ideas, and those wouldn't. So, but in a looser sense, of course, you're right. So, for instance, on issues to do with content, so what is allowed and what is not allowed, of course, that's wholly localized because it's hugely dependent on local culture. So, to take a slightly silly, facetious example, but I think it's still a telling one, every time I travel to Scandinavia, I get berated by Scandinavian policymakers for what they think are our prudish global standards against nudity. And they say, why can't we post our nude summer holiday pictures in the sunny Baltics on Facebook? And we say, well, it's just against our rules. And they say, well, that's against our culture. And so you get this over and over again. Every place thinks that they... And I think in the end, it shouldn't be for a tech company to decide in terms of content what is and what is not legal or illegal content. In that sense, it is localized. On your wider issue about the kind of pendulum, so I couldn't agree with you more. I think, as I alluded earlier, we're in the middle of this huge swing from with hindsight, naive sort of techno-utopianism, this belief that new technology was going to solve every problem under the sun, and now we're swinging the other direction where every problem is ascribed to technology. Of course, the truth is somewhere in between, as it often is in life, and I think the pendulum will only come to rest once you have regulation and guardrails promulgated, particularly promulgated by democratic jurisdictions such as India, so that people feel that technology is there to serve society and society is not there to serve technology. And I think we're in the really important stages of drawing those legislative and regulatory lines, and doing so intelligently is going to be immensely important, because you get it wrong, you can really squander a lot of the beauty of technology. Get it right, and hopefully people feel more comfortable with the very prevalent role that technology now plays in our everyday lives.
So how do we get it right? So yesterday in the conversation, there were suggestions made that the UN should now look at a new compact, a declaration on digital rights. there is a sense that fragmentation is problematic, but there are opportunities. Globalization can happen through fragmentation when a new compact is found. So, Nick, if I can push you, is how do we get this compact right? How do we get different jurisdictions to connect? What is that organizing body principle that makes this happen? Or are we just left to an organic structure that will just take time to create those new terms of reference?
So I have a very specific suggestion. It was sort of lovely to think that you could have some great multilateral body in the sky where everybody gets together and effortlessly agrees on things. I just, much though I'm a multilateralist, I just don't think any day soon you're going to have on the sort of UN scale of things the level of granular consensus you need. Because the devil's in the detail. We can all trade bromides and cliches and sort of lots of motherhood and apple pie. It's the detail that counts. So I have a slightly alternative suggestion, which is this. My view is, if the three great techno-democracies in the world can broadly align on the principles which they think should underpin the governance of the internet, and those three great techno-democracies are clearly India, the US, and the European Union. I think if they can broadly align, and there are dialogues going on, some of them are sort of two-way, occasionally three-way, but if they can broadly align on some of these very foundational governance questions you've asked me about, I think that would be transformative. Because look, people often talk about the global internet. The global internet doesn't exist. It's a fiction. We don't have a single global internet. We have a Chinese-style internet, which is very successful from their point of view, but it's based on a wholly different cultural, ethical, and social paradigm than what we're used to in India and many other parts of the world, which is it's a walled-off internet, heavily surveilled within it. Other jurisdictions like Russia were even prior to the invasion of Ukraine, were sort of moving in that direction, and I suspect will move even faster in that direction. India, the European Union, and the US, of course, are not identical by any stretch of the imagination. They all have their own different specificities and cultures and differences and so on. But they're all based on a belief in entrepreneurialism and a belief in individual sovereignty and liberty and a belief in ingenuity and a belief in the dynamism of the market. I think if they could align on some of these big principles, that would act as a great locomotive to ensure that the kind of closed paradigm of the internet doesn't become a growing and encroaching reality for many billions of people in the future, which I think would be a great shame.
So we've got a democratic triangle, EU, United States, India. Let me bring it back to India, and I think it'll be amiss if I don't ask you a direct question on the Indian government's current efforts at a new regulatory architecture, which to many of us seem pragmatic. It's a simpler architecture, it's clearer, it can deliver for the country, and on localization, as you say, at the moment, actually, it's four lines in the entire draft, which essentially means by default, it's either free flow of data, or by default, it's not. And there may be a positive list, a negative list. I suppose adequacy agreements will have to be worked out, so on and so forth. What do you make of the Indian government's new efforts, and fairly pragmatic efforts, if I may say, at creating this architecture?
I'm basically very positive, for exactly the reasons that you described. I think the new data or the DPDP bill seems to me to be clear, cogent. It has great clarity about what it's trying to achieve. I mean, it of course remits a huge amount of detail to sort of execution, and there's a huge amount that can, there are lots of twists and turns in terms of how you interpret it and apply it. But I think the basic, listen, it's not exactly as I would write the legislation, but of course it's not there. It's not written to please West Coast American platforms, and nor should it be, by the way. It's there, to serve the people of India and Indian society. But I think in broad terms, it seems to me the Indian government has done some really thoughtful work in terms of this revised draft. It's a clear, cogent piece of draft legislation, and I really want to congratulate everybody who I think has worked on this. Because look, I was in government myself. government has a certain governments around the world, or the way that governments operate. It can be sometimes quite difficult for governments to sort of accept that maybe they need to kind of revise and rethink. It seems to me that what has happened is there's been a real process of openness. People have listened to feedback, and that's been enshrined in the new text. I think it's a really promising turn of events.
These new terms of reference that we've been talking about are going to need interlocutors. In many ways, you're an ideal interlocutor. You were in government, you were Deputy Prime Minister, now you're one of the leading voices, one of the largest tech companies in the world. If I go back to your point about the EU, the United States, and India, that is going to have to, at some point, take the threads together, pull in the 5 principles or 5 values that kind of shape what a triumvirate may look like down the line, for instance. We're going to need interlocutors, we're going to need bridges to make this happen. So how do you see your role, and if I can kind of broaden this out on a more personal level, professional politics, tech company, interlocutor, you hit all the spots. How's it going for you in trying to figure the space out?
How's it going for me? Well, that's a work in progress. But one of them, when Mark Zuckerberg and at that time Sheryl Sandberg approached me, from my point of view, somewhat out of the blue in late 2018. I think one of the things I found so attractive about what they proposed at the time, and have hugely enjoyed ever since, is if you are, I'm in a sense I'm a refugee from British and European politics, and if you're lucky enough, as I've been in my life, to sort of work in different environments. I spent 10 years in the sort of EU environment and 12 years as an MP and a party leader and deputy prime minister. I'm now working for a Silicon Valley company. Of course, what you realize is that so many of these places that I've at least worked in are sort of bubbles in themselves. And all bubbles are the same. All bubbles, firstly, everybody who works in a bubble thinks they're the most important bubble in the world. And they think that everybody else is constantly thinking about them. So, each of those 3 bubbles I've worked in, the Brussels bubble, the Westminster bubble, the Silicon Valley bubble, all bubbles are somewhat self-regarding, somewhat introverted. And what I certainly noticed, and I noticed this myself when I was in government, is that, quite a lot is lost in translation. Politicians, in my view, are too ready to assume that the only thing that these platforms want is they've got some rapacious, greedy wish just to kind of monetize every millisecond of people's attention. And there's this whole, in my view, almost wholly false narrative that's taken root that we somehow algorithmically hook people onto our services with extreme and nasty content to get them keep. And then conversely, technologists think that politicians don't know anything about technology. They have no idea, what an even algorithm is, even if it hit them in the face. They have no idea what they're doing. They're just spouting stuff. It's extremely damaging when such powerful entities in society, engineers and technologists on the one hand, politicians and policymakers on the other, sort of shout past each other or sort of throw rocks at each other. And of course, it's very easy to do that, and the media loves it. Certainly these days, if you're a politician in my country, for instance, the United Kingdom, if you want to get a headline, you just say something beastly and nasty about Silicon Valley companies, and you get wall-to-wall, coverage. But in the end, we all occupy the same society. In the end, we all want societies which thrive, which are safe, which are wholesome, where kids grow up, happy and well-educated and well-fed and so on and so forth. And technology, in my view, I remain an ardent optimist about technology. All technologies can have downsides, can be used by bad people to do bad things. But if we want to get the best out of technology and mitigate the bad dimensions of technology, technologists and politicians have just got to understand each other better. And if I can play a small role in acting as a sort of interpreter between these 2 tribes, then, of course, I'm delighted to do it and delighted to continue to do it.
Nick Clegg, Bubble Breaker, thank you so much for spending the time with us at the Global Tech Summit. Thank you.
Thank you.